Hey, welcome back to Gaming Bench. I took a little longer on this one, but I hope you like this because I've got 20 GPUs, actually 21, 22 if you want to count the 9800 X3D testing of the RTX 4090. So there's a lot to go through. I've got older and newer cards, and starting here at 3050 versus 6600, this is our baseline budget card, $200, and the 6600 easily outpaces the 3050 8GB. That is typical. We see this in most games. The 3050 8GB card is really just pretty slow, and that's why it's now selling for $200. It's still sitting around on shelves because it hasn't sold out. Kicking up a step, this time we've got the 4060 going up against the previous generation 3060 12GB card. There is an 8GB card now. We won't worry about that. I didn't test it. I don't even have one. Fine. And if you look at the performance, the 4060 is faster, but this is at 1080p medium. Once we kick up to higher settings, that 8GB VRAM buffer on the 4060 starts to become a problem. In fact, it's a problem with 8GB on a lot of cards when we're running Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024. Next step up, we are going to shift up to the 4060 with the 7600. So now we're kind of apples to apples, AMD and Nvidia. I guess the 7600 is the cheaper card, but I've had to kind of rearrange the comparison points for the video just because there's so many cards to get through, and I don't want to show every single card or show the same card multiple times. I've already showed 4060 twice. 7600 and 4060, the AMD card is a little bit faster. That's not a huge deal, but it's getting, around 87 frames per second compared to just 78 frames per second on Nvidia. Moving on, this time we have the 4060 Ti. This is the default 8GB version, and the RX 7700 XT. These do cost about the same price, right around $380, $390. I guess MSRP is maybe $399 on the Nvidia card, and I think it's $399 on the AMD as well, but the price on the AMD has dropped a bit. And AMD's card is way faster. At least when you're not doing ray tracing or DLSS frame generation and upscaling, the 7700 XT is easily superior to the 4060 Ti. So you're paying a lot extra to get into the Nvidia ecosystem is what it amounts to. And people are willing to pay that. So then our next step up, we go to the 4060 Ti 16GB card, which costs $449 MSRP, and it's really not on sale anywhere. Like, no one is discounting this that I'm seeing recently, compared to the 7800 XT, which launched at $499. It's now more like $449 as well. So these are price comparison, they're equal. And again, AMD just totally destroys Nvidia here, getting about 150 frames per second on AMD compared to just 97 frames per second on Nvidia. Not a good buy to go Team Green here, unless you're going to use upscaling and frame generation, because frame generation is only supported on Nvidia DLSS 3. There is no FSR2 support right now. We'll get to that later. Next step up, 4070 and 7900 GRE. Both cards nominally priced at $549. The 4070, we have seen some sales recently where it's dropped down to $499. The GRE tends to be a little bit more expensive, probably because, again, it's a lot faster. 160 frames per second here at 1080p medium compared to about 122 frames per second. And we're starting to bump into CPU limits on the AMD cards as well, so keep that in mind. 9800 X3D probably would alleviate that somewhat, but I didn't test every card on the 9800 X3D. I'll shift to that in the future videos probably, but for now I've got 13900K. The 4070 Super and 7900 XT, this time you're looking at $599 for Nvidia versus maybe $629, $639 on AMD. So there's a price advantage for Nvidia technically, but performance advantage, even though we're hitting CPU bottlenecks and so we're getting about 162 frames per second, the 4070 Super is down at 140 frames per second, 138 frames per second. once again, advantage, AMD. That's going to be a continual refrain throughout this video if you can't tell. So sticking with the 7900 XT just because there's not much left on the AMD side to go up to, and we've got the 4070 Ti Super this time. So this is sort of a $799 Nvidia card. Been on sale for maybe $749 recently, still over $100 more than the 7900 XT, and at these settings the 7900 XT is still faster. The AMD cards are hitting a bottleneck at around 160 to 165 frames per second, while the Nvidia cards are hitting a bottleneck of closer to 150 frames per second, and we're getting pretty much that on the 4070 Ti Super. So everything else is going to be similar bottlenecks. The 4080 Super also getting around 150 frames per second, 149 technically, and the 7900 XTX is getting 164 frames per second. Not a huge advantage, but that's because the CPU is limiting things, and AMD's hardware scheduling and other differences in their drivers and hardware level basically mean that when you're CPU limited, AMD often takes the lead. It's not like a huge lead, but 10% is not uncommon. So 150 compared to 165, that's about what we can expect. Finally, we have the 4090, RTX 4090 against the XTX, and pretty much performance is the same as we just saw on the 4080 Super because CPU bottlenecks. The 4090 is like 1 frame per second faster on average. Maybe the extra memory bandwidth or VRAM or whatever is helping out, but nothing to get super excited about. But our final thing, once we finish with this test, and I'll hold that until we get to the next section because I don't want to just ramble on the whole time. But this test is the Isafjord landing challenge under the Epic landing challenges on the Iceland map because it seemed to be reasonably taxing. So final test, we've got 13900K, Core i9 13900K from Intel versus AMD's Ryzen 7 9800 X3D. Widely considered the fastest gaming processor now by AMD, but it doesn't universally end up being faster. It does at these settings, so we're getting almost 170 frames per second on the 4090 with the AMD processor compared to just under 140 frames per second with the older Intel processor. Slightly newer 14900K might bump that up a few percent. The 285K, the new Core Ultra 9 285K probably would be slower. And here's the overall standings at 1080p medium, native resolution, no upscaling, using DirectX 12. It's only supported API now. Previous generation Flight Simulator 2020 had DX11 and DX12. DX12 was in beta. Now DX11 is gone and we're only DX12. Not really struggling too badly. Performance is lower than on the prior gen game, the 2020 release. That's kind of expected. CPU limits maybe not quite as hard. Like the 9800 X3D really does well with the older Flight Simulator. It doesn't offer quite as much headroom with the 2024 release, maybe because of DirectX 12, maybe because of other threading optimizations. But everything's playable at 1080p medium, everything that I tested from $200 cards on up. So let's kick up to the ultra settings. And yeah, I could have done high in between, but you just totally increase the benchmarking time by massive amounts when you start adding extra test settings. And I've already got 6 things to run through. It's going to take a while. So let me tell you about the testing. We've got 3050 and 6600 in the background. You can see how they perform. Big performance hit on both cards relative to the medium settings. VRAM is an issue. AMD has newer drivers now that are supposed to be game ready for Flight Simulator 2024. Actually, they do worse at 1080p Ultra and above on the 8GB cards. So like the 6600 totally died. So these are the 24.10.1 drivers from AMD compared to the newer 24.12.1. 24.12.1 seemed to increase performance at 1080p medium on some cards, not all of them because of CPU bottlenecks, but also dropped it on others. 4060 and 3060 in the background, relatively close performance, probably because 12 gigabytes versus 8 gigabytes. So the older card had 12 gigabytes, and that's helping it to narrow the gap a little bit. And we'll see if it can surpass it at higher resolutions. Isofjord, why am I testing here? Well, it's a low-level landing challenge, and with the big lake or ocean or whatever you want to call the fjord here, it tends to be more demanding. If you're flying high up in the atmosphere on a clear day, Flight Simulator 2024 will run faster. But I don't want to show like ideal easy scenarios. I want to show a more demanding scenario, which is why I did the landing challenge in Iceland. 4060 and 7600. 4060 is doing better. 7600, again, with the latest drivers, performance totally sucks. Like 10 frames per second or something that's not really usable. I assume AMD is probably going to do more optimizations on a future driver release to get performance back where it was before the 24.12.1 drivers. So something regressed, or there's more memory use happening. I don't know why that would happen other than whatever, bad code. 7600 XT has 16 gigabytes of memory, higher power limits, slightly higher clocks compared to the 7600, and performance ends up being, what is that, 25% faster, 30% faster? It's a pretty big jump for cards that are otherwise the same. So it shows that 16 gigabyte, or at least more than 8 gigabytes of memory really does help in Flight Simulator 2024 at ultra settings. You don't need to run ultra settings. If you go back and look at the medium quality settings, it still looks pretty good. Maybe a blend of high and medium quality would work better on some GPUs. Keep that in mind. 4060 Ti, 7700 XT. The AMD card is running away with it as usual. About 20% faster performance overall. And considering that the AMD 7700 card costs less than the 4060 Ti, not a lot less, but I think it's usually about $10 less right now, unless sales change things. It's definitely the better buy if your primary focus is Flight Simulator. And there's also other considerations. VR support. I don't do VR. It takes up too much space. I don't like it. I sweat too much when I put the headsets on, so I just don't do VR. If you care about VR, I'm sorry, you'll have to go and look at someone else's videos or benchmarks. 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte and the 7800 XT. The 4060 Ti didn't see any benefit of 16 gigabytes versus 8 gigabytes at these settings. Higher settings it will become a factor, but here it's not, and so the 7800 XT is like 10%-ish, 12% faster than the 7700 XT, which means the gap has just widened at these cards. So all AMD all the time for Flight Simulator 2024, if that's all you're worried about, unless you want to do frame generation. Maybe they'll do FSR3 at some point, but don't count on it because the last one never got FSR3 either. And this one has FSR2. 4070 versus RX 7900 GRE. This is not looking good for Nvidia again. And there's lots of reasons for that. More compute on the GRE, more bandwidth, more memory, more. And so on a rasterization game, it ends up performing better. And if you're looking at the images and you're going, wait, they don't look identical. Like, I'm sorry, there's differences in the video capture. And there's also, so I've actually got Arc B580 testing, if you saw that on the last chart. And they took out their video capture support through the drivers, so I can't do that anymore. So I have to figure out something new like OBS for recording, which is kind of a pain in the butt. 4070 Super 7900 XT, roughly the same price, and AMD is running almost, 25% faster. It's a pretty big gap. If you care about performance more than you care about software features and AI and ray tracing, AMD is the way to go. We'll see what happens when we get the next generation cards, which are rumored to be coming in January, February timeframe. Maybe RDNA 4 will close the gap on ray tracing, and hopefully do better everywhere else as well, so that it can keep up with Nvidia. 4070 Ti Super 7900 XT. This time AMD has a much bigger price advantage. It costs, like I said before, $630 versus about $750 to $800, and it's still 10 to 15% faster, about maybe even 20%. So from budget to mid-range to high-end to extreme, AMD is the better pick for Flight Simulator 2024 at most of the settings I've tested. And I do native testing for most of this because that's the most fair way of doing it, the fairest way of doing it. Who's the fairest of them all? If you do upscaling, DLSS upscaling is not the same as FSR upscaling, whether it's FSR2 or FSR3 or even FSR1, which is totally different. That's spatial upscaling, and it definitely doesn't look as good as FSR2, 3, or DLSS or XeSS. XeSS I don't think is supported in 2024 release right now. We'll see if that changes in the future. 4080 Super and 7900 XTX were about not the same. AMD had the advantage, but they're getting a little closer. 97 to 100 frames per second versus 93. And the 4090 is sitting here. It's still CPU limited, so we're getting around 94 frames per second versus 93 frames per second on the 4080 Super. And then the XTX is getting 100 frames per second versus about 97 frames per second on the 7900 XT. So still hitting CPU limits pretty much. They're just lower CPU limits than at medium settings. Our last look then, after the XTX, we'll go and look at the 4090 with the 9800X3D and with the 13900K. And the 9800X3D is clearly running faster. On average, I got 107 frames per second versus 94 frames per second. That's over a 10% difference. And the recording screenshots won't show those same numbers because doing video capture while running this test does reduce performance a little bit. It increases the CPU load maybe a little bit as well. You can see that the CPU is running at 55-ish% utilization on the 9800X3D compared to 30-ish% on the 13900K. And the power, for whatever reason, the RTSS, the Riva Tuner statistics server, doesn't capture power and other information on the 9800X3D yet. They'll need to do a new release. Here's the overall standings. Still hitting CPU limits on 13900K at the top, but most of the other GPUs are not totally CPU limited, and so that's about where you can expect them. Arc B580, I'm going to have a separate review of that, looking at performance across like 10 games. Keep in mind that's a $250 card, so price-wise, it costs the same as a 7600, costs less than the 4060. You might be able to get a 3060 12GB for that same price. It's doing really well. It's almost matching the $400 card from Nvidia, splitting the difference between the $300 and $400 cards from AMD. Definitely worth a look. Drivers are a concern. I'll talk about that in the full review. So, kicking up a level, why am I doing 1440p Ultra instead of like 1440p High? Well, first of all, 1080p High versus 1080p Medium, you wouldn't see that much of a difference in performance, and I want a wider difference, so I go from Medium to Ultra settings. Once we're at 1080p Ultra, I don't want to go up a resolution but down a step on quality settings, because then you don't know which affected it more. So you can look at the 1080p medium results and the 1080p ultra results to kind of get an idea of where 1080p high would land midway between them. Take that same scaling factor and apply it to lower tier GPUs or upper tier GPUs at a higher resolution, and you can get an idea. You can fill in the blanks is my approach. 1440p ultra, you're increasing the resolution from 1080p Ultra. So we're only changing the one variable. We're not changing multiple things and creating confusion. Could you do 1440p medium, 1440p high, 1440p Ultra, do all those tests? Yes, if I did every test at every resolution from low, medium, high, ultra, then I've got 4 test settings and 3 resolutions, and I end up with 12 tests per GPU versus up to 4 tests per GPU, and you want to do apples to apples. So if you're going to run the 4060 Ti at 1080p high, you need to compare it against anything else running 1080p high. So you have to test that. And then it's like, well, now if you want to see what happens at 1080p ultra, you need to run 1080p ultra at everything else. So it just becomes super time consuming. I figure 4 tests is a pretty good balance. And I've also got upscaling and frame gen results at the end. So there's a lot to cover. And while I've been talking, we've had the 4060 Ti 8GB, now 16GB versus a 7800, and nothing really has changed. AMD still has a significant advantage in both price and performance, or however you want to phrase that. So the 7700 XT $390 versus 4060 Ti $390 versus the 4060 Ti 16GB at $450. You know, in terms of memory requirements at 1440p Ultra, the 16GB card is now just barely ahead of the 8GB card from the RTX 4060 from Nvidia. Still not really hitting memory capacity limits on Nvidia's cards, but we are starting to see them on the AMD cards. So like the 7600 XT got 35 frames per second, while the 7600 only got 28. And that's with the older drivers that didn't seem to have a memory problem on ultra settings. The latest drivers, I think I was getting sub 10 frames per second on the 7600. I didn't use those. Keep that in mind. 4070 Super, 7900 XT, Nvidia costs a bit less and runs a lot slower. But you can make up the difference if you turn on frame generation, fake frames. For Flight Simulator, I think frame generation is probably your ideal case because it's not a Twitch game. Like, maybe if you're flying the jet, you might need faster response times, but in general, you're just flying and you're going straight and curving, and yeah, you don't need the high response, super high frame rates that you might benefit from in a competitive shooter when you're playing a flight simulation. 4070 Ti Super, 7900 XT, still heavily slanted in AMD's favor. Looking at a card that costs over $100 less and is performing almost 20% faster. The performance in my charts, I've got 67 on Nvidia and 77 on the 7900 XT. So 10 FPS at 67 ends up being like 15%, I guess. Moving up to the next level, we have AMD's fastest GPU, 7900 XTX. I do have to wonder, will we get an 8900 XTX? There are rumors that AMD might not even go with high-end cards on this next generation, sort of like it did with Polaris in the RX 400 series, RX 500 series. They did Polaris, and then like a year and a half later, they did Vega. So Vega was supposed to be their high end, and Polaris was their low end. The RDNA 1 generation, the RX 5000 series, they didn't really have an ultra high end solution. The RX 5700 XT basically matched performance of roughly the 4070, and they just AMD didn't even try competing above that line on performance. They did a lot better on price, and that was when Nvidia came out with all the ray tracing marketing. And the 5000 series, if it weren't for cryptocurrency mining, it would have sold really poorly. I think cryptocurrency kind of saved AMD's GPU sales in that generation. I mentioned this earlier. Let me clarify this again. Video capture. AMD video encoding when it captures to AV1 and Nvidia video capture when it captures to AV1. They're doing different things with the colors. If you have the screen and you watch this, they look pretty much the same as far as I can tell. But when you're capturing video, the AMD card just looks a little more yellow, I guess. I mean, this is interesting because this is 13900K and 9800 X3D, and they also look different. So go figure. Cloud's different. I guess I was hoping the landing challenge would be the same every time. but it looks like there is variability in the clouds, and we just have to assume it's not going to impact performance too much. Should note here, so 1440p Ultra, the 13900K and the 9800 X3D are basically tied. 91 frames per second on both, slightly 78 FPS on the minimum frame rates versus 76 FPS. So you're not getting a huge advantage from the higher, faster, supposedly CPU anymore. I think you would still see an advantage if you were looking at the previous generation, Flight Simulator 2020, and you still hit CPU bottlenecks at 1440p, but there's more GPU demands in the new version, and so there's less of a CPU bottleneck factor with the 4090. We'll have to see how that applies to other GPUs, but in general, if you're playing at 1440p with the current generation cards, you don't need to worry so much about which GPU or which processor you're running for your GPU. With the 50 series and the forthcoming 8000 series, maybe that will matter more. Probably will. Like a 5090, it will probably need the fastest CPU you can get in order to not be bottlenecked at 1440p, even in a game like Flight Simulator 2024. Alright, next step up, we've got Ultra settings at 4K. The little spikes you see at the start, roughly in the middle of those charts, that's just the loading screens, so that's not how the game runs initially. We've got 3060 12GB versus 7600 XT with 16GB. AMD's card is running faster. That's not surprising. It's a newer generation. It's not maybe as big of a gap as you would expect, but the interesting thing here is that the 4060 with 8GB actually runs worse than the 3060 12GB card at these settings. I didn't show a 4060 video for that reason. You shouldn't try playing 4K Ultra without upscaling in this game on a 4060. It just doesn't work well. 4060 Ti will skip the 8GB card and we'll go straight to the 16GB card with the 7700 XT. So AMD's card costs less. I need to fit everything in without going overboard. This is already like a almost 40-minute video, I think. Hopefully I can remember to put in jump codes and you guys will cut me some slack on the in-depth coverage. Thanks for watching, by the way. If you're still here, if you're listening to all this, thank you. Please like and subscribe. Please share. Please skip to the parts that you really want to care and see about, so if you don't care about 4K Ultra because you're running a 1440p monitor, that's fine. So next step up, we have the RX 7800 XT and the RTX 4070. Different priced cards now, maybe $450 for the AMD card compared to perhaps $500 to $550 on the Nvidia card. And Nvidia is slower here by 10% or so, or I guess if you want to flip it the other way, the RX 7800 XT is almost 20% faster, give or take. Definitely in favor of AMD on this comparison. Again, like I keep saying that because it's true. It's stream of consciousness, which is what you got to do when you're doing this 40-minute video stuff. And I don't know if you guys will like that or hate it. Let me know in the comments. So now we've got 7900 GRE against the 4070 Super. And we're getting about 40 frames per second on AMD compared to about 36 frames per second on Nvidia. But Nvidia's card is more expensive. It costs $599 compared to $539. Officially $549, but I've seen it routinely for $519 to $529 as the base model, and you should just get the base model. Don't worry about the upscale models. They're just a ripoff. 4070 Ti Super, $800 card, 7900 XT, $650 or less card. Clearly pricing advantage to AMD, getting about 47 frames per second versus 42 frames per second. Both are still playable at 4K Ultra. That's important. And you can turn on upscaling to get a 20 to 30%-ish performance boost, something like that. FSR2 upscaling versus DLSS upscaling. DLSS does look better. It's provable. quantifiable. I think we need a better way of like actually doing that, but it's hard because getting identical video runs for both APIs, like you can try and do it, but even built-in benchmarks, there will be minor variations that make it so that you can't use tools like VMAF to try and compare which is better. Anyway, 7900 XTX and 4080 Super basically tied, getting 53 frames per second on both. The 4080 Super actually has a minor, very minor, minimum FPS advantage, 48 versus 47. There's, you know, middle of the 7900 XTX. It's going off the left side now. You see that little spikiness, just a little bit of frame rate variability at times. That drops the minimum average. And then 4090 versus XTX. Obviously, if the 4080 Super was tied with the XTX, the 4090 is going to be faster, getting about 64 frames per second compared to 53. So that's almost a 20% advantage now. Clearly, we are not CPU limited anymore. We are mostly GPU limited. In a fully GPU limited scenario, the 4090 can be anywhere from 30 to 50% faster than the 4080 Super and 7900 XTX. It kind of depends on the game. Ray tracing is pretty much what you'd want for the 50% differences, but it's still a pretty big gap. And then finally, this is kind of interesting, 13900K and 9800 X3D with the 4090. Which one is faster? Well, in my benchmarks, the 13900K actually comes out ahead. 64 versus 62 FPS. You can see that in the top corners, getting a 1 to 2 FPS advantage for the older Intel processor. I don't know why. Like, it has less system memory bandwidth. It uses more power. We can't see the power on the 9800 X3D, but I'm sure it's not 140 watts. Can't see the temperature on the 9800 X3D either. Come on, Riva Tuner. Get your thing updated for the 9000 series. And then here's the overall standings. B580, Arc B580, matching pretty much the RTX 4060 Ti. 16 gigabyte card beats the 8 gigabyte card. 4060 loses to the 3060 12 gigabyte. Didn't test the 7600 vanilla card because it fell off the face of the earth. So did the 3050. Hopefully driver updates can make that better. At the top, 4080 Super, 7900 XT. Things are a little closer on price versus performance at 4K. Nvidia seems to close the gap a bit, at least with certain models. I mean, the 4070 still loses to the similarly priced 7900 GRE by 33%. So there are areas where if you're looking at the best bang for the buck, it's obviously AMD or Intel now. Battle Mage B580. It's not a bad GPU. Drivers, not perfect, but if you're willing to cut them a little bit of slack, it works great. So finally, let's turn on upscaling, quality mode upscaling. So it's 60% rendering, 2.25x upscale. Like if you do 67% on the X resolution and the Y resolution, horizontal and vertical resolution, you multiply that out and it's actually 2.25x more pixels to do native 4K versus quality upscaling 1440p scaled to 4K. And you also need a little bit more VRAM, which is why I'm doing the 3060 12 gigabyte versus the 7600 XT. The 4060 8 gigabyte card fell flat on its face. So did the 4060 Ti 8 gigabyte card, which is why we've got the 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte card. And even here, the 7700 XT costs less by $50, $60, and runs at 44 frames per second compared to 35 frames per second on Nvidia. So upscaling alone is not doing it for Nvidia. Even if it looks a little cleaner, at 4K it's really hard to tell the difference. You have to really pixel peep and freeze frames and all that stuff. At 1080p, DLSS is much easier to tell, like, hey, this is doing better quality than FSR2 or FSR3. XeSS is usually the middle ground. It looks better than FSR2 3, but worse than DLSS. But there are sometimes weird artifacts with XeSS as well that you don't see on DLSS. Like ghosting, I see more ghosting with XeSS, I feel. It varies by game implementation as well, because are they using XeSS 3.1? Sorry, 1.3.1 or 1.3.0 or 1.2 or 1.1. 1.1 looked pretty bad. 1.0 looked worse. 1.2 looks okay, and then 1.3 is kind of where things got as good as they're likely to get, give or take. 4070, 7800 XT, the AMD card still leading by a small amount and costing less. So 7900 GRE and 4070 Super, the AMD card, still leading by a modest amount and cost less. 58 frames per second versus 53 frames per second when I'm not recording, capturing video. The AMD cards are not as power efficient. Do need to mention that. I don't think anyone, unless you're paying 50 cents per kilowatt hour maybe, you shouldn't worry so much about power, because like, hey, we're using 250 watts versus 200 watts, 195 watts, whatever. So 60 watts more. Like if you played 8 hours a day, 60 watts times 8 hours, that's 480 watts, which means 0.5 watt hours. So if you're paying 50 cents per watt hour, that would be 25 cents in a day. I guess that's sort of maybe matters. 100 days, that's $25. You could make up the difference if you play a whole lot of games. 4070 Ti Super and 7900 XT. AMD leading on performance, getting about 68 frames per second compared to 59 frames per second. And AMD is using 309 watts compared to 240-ish watts. So it's not all AMD all the time in every area, but as a value option, it definitely wins most comparisons. 7900 XT X versus 4080 Super. It's back to leading the 4080 Super by a couple frames per second, probably because bandwidth is now more of a factor at 4K even with upscaling. Probably also because DLSS upscaling is a little more difficult. You have to do tensor core operations versus simplified shader operations, so the higher quality you get from DLSS would explain why it has a little bit more overhead. It's not a huge deal, but they're pretty much tied. And AMD costs less and it uses more power. And the 4090 versus 7900 XTX, let's talk about power for a second, right? If you looked at the last one, the 4080 Super was, I think, around 260 watts of power. Now the 4090 is using 305 watts of power, give or take. So it's still not maxed out. It's not running full tilt using tons of power, nowhere near its 450 watt graphics power limitation, whereas AMD's 7900 XTX is getting very close to its 350 watt 5 watt power limit. So kind of interesting there. Not that you should worry about the 10 cents per day for gaming a lot difference in power costs, but especially on a $2,000 versus $1,000 card. And then 13900K 9800 X3D, as seen before at 4K native, the 13900K just running a hair faster on average, but it's not showing up here because I'm doing recording while doing this. So I guess the 13900K didn't like that as much. There are times where it's 1 frames per second ahead, others where it's 1 FPS behind. On average, I got 83 versus 81. So that's what I'm going to stick with. I guess if you're doing recording or streaming while playing the game, then maybe AMD CPU is a little bit faster. Overall standings, still nothing super interesting to note. Look at the 4060 Ti and 4060 though. 23 versus 22 FPS, so clearly 8 GB performance limits. I also tested the 3060 in both DLSS versus FSR2 mode. Both got the same performance. DLSS was a hair faster. I don't know if that's really significant or important. 6700 XT, I didn't include the videos of that anywhere, but it's still in the charts, outperforming the 7600 XT. It's why 12 gigabytes on a 192-bit interface is better than 16 gigabytes on a 128-bit interface. that applies to the 4060 Ti 16GB as well. Like it does beat the 6700 XT, but it also loses to the 7700 XT. This is why the Arc B580, I like it, but I didn't include the upscaling results for that because I don't think there's XeSS, and I'm busy. Last thing to look at, frame gen. So there is no FSR2 frame gen, so we only have DLSS 3 frame gen. So we've got quality mode upscaling with frame gen, and we are running only Nvidia 40 series. So the cards that I'm going to show, they're just going to be like each card in the next card. So 4060 Ti getting 31 FPS versus 2080 FPS, still hitting some memory bottlenecks clearly, because what we'll see when I move up to the 4060 Ti 16GB is that it gets 40 FPS. So that's 33% faster than the 8GB card. 4070 with 12GB, so it's got less memory than the 16GB 4060 Ti, but it's got a lot more compute, and it's getting 54 FPS compared to 40 FPS. So in that case, that's almost 20% faster, and that's expected. I really, I wish the 4060 Ti had been a 192-bit interface. I think Nvidia royally screwed the pooch when they went with a 128-bit interface. They did it for cost reasons, not because it was the better design decision. 4070 probably needed more than 192-bit. I don't know, like if you did 192-bit on the 4060 Ti, what would you do for the 4070? Maybe they could have done 160-bit and 192-bit and then done 10 gigabytes on the 4060 Ti. I don't know. 4070 Ti Super and 4070 Super, these are both 192-bit interfaces. I think the Ti Super might have faster memory. Maybe not. I should look that up before making any such claims. The 4070 Ti Super is still faster. 87 versus 71 frames per second. So we are not hitting memory bandwidth limitations. That's important to note. So more bandwidth isn't the factor. More memory capacity at 12 gigabytes versus 8 gigabytes. That's important. The memory clocks, they are 21 gigabits per second on both the Ti Super and the 4070. They're all 21 gigabits per second. So don't get caught up on that. 4080 Super, 4090. Not surprising that the 4090 is faster, but it's not that much faster. It's getting 120 versus 110 frames per second. In this case, is that last 9% performance worth the doubling in price? No. Is it worth the 50% more VRAM? For AI workloads, it certainly is. For gaming, not usually. There are certain games, though, where if you want the best, it's the 4090, and next month it will be the 5090. And then last, not least, we have the 4090 with both Intel's 13900K and the AMD 9800X3D. Again, performance is identical. Like the video overlays that you're seeing will show fluctuations. It's not like 100% identical every run. Like you can see more of the water on the 13900K on the right side of the cutoff compared to the 9800X3D. Just slight variances between runs in the game, but I don't think it really affects performance. Maybe it's a little bit faster at the start, a little bit slower at the end, or vice versa. Net result though, 120 FPS average and 102 FPS minimums. But these are frame gen results, so you have to half that for your input speed. I don't think it matters on Flight Simulator again. I think 30 FPS input rates are playable. Even 20 FPS on like the 4060 Ti 16 gigabytes is probably reasonable as an input sampling rate because it's not a Twitch game. But the 31, 28 FPS on those bottom two, the frame gen is not going to be a lovely experience. It's not something that you'd be like, oh man, this feels just like native non-frame gen. It does not. It feels a little bit more sluggish. Flight Simulator hides that because Flight Simulator feels sluggish. You know, you tilt your flaps and the plane starts turning a couple seconds later because the airflow would take time in the real world. Whatever. That's it for this one. I will really try to remember to put jump codes in because looking at the time, it's 45-minute video. Do you like that? Do you hate that? let me know in the comments. Please like and share and subscribe. Even if you don't like the length of this video, please like and share and subscribe anyway. Tell me what you want to change and I will try to change it. Love you guys. Thanks for watching. Have a nice day. Have a great holiday season and maybe upgrade your graphics card. Until next time, we'll see ya.